He thought mocking the quiet bureaucrat would cement his status at the table. Instead, it signed his indictment inside Manhattan's most gilded bistro. A flamboyant mafia boss tried to showcase his dominance by insulting a woman he assumed was a powerless paper pusher. 3 sentences later, the color drained from his face as he realized he'd just challenged the architect of his legal downfall. Cho Ju-bin owned the atmosphere the second he crossed the threshold. Tattoos flashed under the chandelier light. Associates leaned in to catch every boastful word. To him, the restaurant was a stage, and he was the only lead actor. Meryl Robert sat at the next table, invisible by design. To Cho, she was just another nameless suit, a paper pusher hiding behind a briefcase. To the restaurant staff, she was a dignified regular. What no one in that room understood was that Meryl Robert didn't just carry files. She carried the weight of the federal government. She understood every nuance of the organized crime world, the shell companies, the laundered assets, and the exact legal pressure points that could collapse a criminal empire overnight. When Cho decided to use her as his evening's entertainment, he expected a submissive silence. What he got instead was the cold, clinical introduction of the federal counsel who was already freezing his life's work. It wasn't just a comeback. It was the beginning of the end. The air inside. The Gilded Lily smelled of expensive aged bourbon, roasted truffles, and the heavy invisible scent of old power. And it was the kind of Manhattan establishment where the lighting was kept low to hide the faces of people who didn't want to be seen, and the velvet curtains were thick enough to swallow the most scandalous of secrets. The walls were lined with hand-carved dark walnut and mirrors framed in tarnished gold, reflecting a world that moved according to its own gravitational pull, one dictated by net worth and influence. Meryl Robert sat at a small, secluded table near the back, her posture as straight and disciplined as a blade. To any casual observer, she was merely a woman enjoying a solitary dinner, her dark blazer blending into the elegant shadows of the room. She moved with a practiced, invisible grace, her movements efficient and devoid of wasted energy. On the table before her, a slim leather briefcase lay open. At the soft glow of a nearby sconce illuminating the edge of a document stamped with a bold, crimson word, Federal. For Meryl, this wasn't a night off. It was a tactical review. She turned a page with the tip of her finger, her eyes scanning the lines of a RICO indictment with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. She was a creature of procedure, a woman who lived in the quiet spaces between the lines of the law, where cases were won not with shouting, but with the steady accumulation of facts. The atmosphere of the restaurant shifted abruptly as the heavy front doors swung open. The ambient hum of polite conversation dipped, and the staff stiffened, their professional masks tightening. Cho Ju-bin entered the room not as a guest, but as a conqueror claiming his territory. He was sharply dressed in a fitted navy suit that screamed of excess, his white shirt open at the collar to reveal the intricate dark ink of tattoos that climbed his neck like vines. He didn't walk so much as process through the room, flanked by men whose stillness hinted at a capacity for sudden, controlled violence. Cho's energy was animated and loud, a sharp contrast to the refined hush of the bistro. He laughed at a joke made by one of his associates, the sound cutting through the air like a serrated edge, and his eyes, cold and assessing, traveled over the diners as if he were evaluating property. He was a man who performed his power, who required an audience for his dominance to feel real. As he was led to the table adjacent to Meryl's, he adjusted his gold watch, the metal catching the light with a vulgar brilliance. And he took his seat with a heavy thud, leaning forward with a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Meryl didn't look up. She remained focused on the file, her calm, controlled expression suggesting a mind that was already miles ahead, calculating the next move in a game Cho didn't even know he was playing. The Gilded Lily was a room full of predators, but as Cho Ju-bin began to loudly hold court, he had no idea that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the man with the tattoos, but the quiet woman at the next table holding a pen. The transition from the grand entrance to the seat was a performance in itself, a choreographed display of dominance designed to remind everyone in the room exactly who held the leash. Cho Ju-bin settled into his chair with a heavy, proprietary air, while his associates fanning out around him like satellites orbiting a dark sun. He didn't order from the menu. He simply pointed, a gesture of a man used to having his desires anticipated without the clumsiness of request. It didn't take long for his attention to drift. Men like Cho were fueled by the reactions of others, and Meryl's refusal to acknowledge his presence was a vacuum he felt compelled to fill. He leaned back, his gold watch glinting as he draped an arm over the chair, his cold, assessing eyes settling on the woman at the next table. "You see this, boys?" Cho's voice was loud, projected with the practiced resonance of someone who wanted the entire restaurant to listen. He didn't look at his men. He looked at the back of Meryl's head. The city is burning. The streets are alive. And yet we have people who spend their Friday nights staring at ink on a page. Boring, lifeless. His associates snickered on cue, a sharp, sycophantic sound that rippled through the air. Cho leaned closer, crossing the invisible boundary between their tables. He caught a glimpse of the federal stamp on the top sheet of her briefcase, and a slow, mocking grin curved his lips. "Look at that," he continued, his tone dripping with a feigned, oily sympathy. "The government suit is working late. Tell me, do they pay you by the hour to be this dull? Or is the misery a job requirement? All that paperwork, all those little signatures. Do you actually believe those stapled pages make you matter in a world like this?" Meryl's hand remained steady as she turned another page. She didn't stiffen, didn't sigh. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a narrowed eye or a tightened jaw. Her silence was a fortress, but to Cho, it was a challenge. He mistook her professional restraint for the paralysis of a victim, a small brain confused by his proximity. "Maybe she can't hear us," one of the associates chimed in, emboldened by Cho's lead. "Maybe the bureaucracy has finally turned her into a statue." Cho laughed, a harsh barking sound that caused the diners at the nearby tables to lower their heads. "She's not a statue. She's just a paper pusher who thinks a title on an ID badge is a shield. It's pathetic, really, watching someone play pretend at power while the real world is happening right in front of them." He leaned in even further, the scent of his expensive cologne invading her space, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous rasp. You're wasting your time, sweetheart. In this city, the only thing that matters is who has the nerve to take what they want. Paper burns, titles fade, but people like me, we're the ones who write the rules you're so busy reading." He waited for a reaction, for a flinch, for the inevitable stammering apology of a subordinate caught in a predator's gaze. But Meryl Robert simply reached for her wine glass, her movements as fluid and unhurried as if she were entirely alone in the room. The performance was reaching its peak, but the lead actor was beginning to realize his co-star wasn't following the script. The silence at Meryl's table was no longer a lack of sound. It had become a physical weight, a dense barrier that Cho's insults seemed to strike and slide off like blunt arrows. Around them, the restaurant had grown unnervingly quiet. The clinking of silverware and the low murmur of other diners had tapered off as the surrounding tables realized they were witnessing a slow-motion collision. Cho Ju-bin's smirk began to twitch. He was a man who lived for the give and take of intimidation. The flinch, the stutter, the frantic attempt to appease his ego. But Meryl Robert provided him with nothing. She took a slow, methodical sip of her Cabernet, her gaze remaining fixed on a specific paragraph in her file. Her lack of reaction was a profound insult to a man who considered himself the sun around which the room orbited. By refusing to acknowledge him, she was effectively stating that he was not a threat, not a peer, and certainly not worth the energy of a response. "I'm talking to you, bureaucrat," Cho said, his voice dropping an octave. losing its performative playfulness for something sharper and more jagged. He tapped a manicured finger on the edge of her table, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud sounding like a ticking clock. Is the government paying you so little that you've lost your tongue along with your personality? Or are you just hoping that if you play dead long enough, I'll get bored and go away? One of his associates, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, leaned in with a cruel grin. Maybe she's recording us, boss. Maybe she thinks that little briefcase is a wire. Cho snorted, though his eyes remained fixed on Meryl's profile. Recording? For what? To report me for being mean to a lonely woman? Please. People like this don't take action. They take notes. They file reports that sit in basements until the ink fades to gray. Meryl finally moved, but not in the way Cho expected. She didn't look up. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a silver fountain pen, and made a single, precise notation at the bottom of a page. The scratching of the nib on the heavy paper was the only sound in the immediate radius. The deliberate nature of the act, continuing her work in the face of a direct threat, was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The tension in the air was now thick enough to stifle. The headwaiter hovered 10 feet away, his face pale, torn between the duty to protect a patron and the survival instinct that told him never to cross Cho Ju-bin. The other diners watched through the reflections in the gold-framed mirrors, their expressions a mix of pity and morbid fascination. They saw a woman being cornered, but they also saw something else. A coldness in Meryl that suggested she wasn't the one who was trapped. Cho's face flushed a deep, angry red, the tattoos on his neck seeming to pulse with his quickening heartbeat. He was losing the room. The sycophantic laughter of his men had grown thin and forced. They were looking for a victory, a breaking point, but Meryl's silence had turned the restaurant into a vacuum that was slowly suffocating Cho's bravado. He realized that as long as she remained silent, she was the one in control. To reclaim his dominance, he would have to do more than speak. He would have to force her to see him, a decision that would prove to be the most expensive mistake of his life. The rejection of his presence was a poison that Cho Ju-bin could no longer digest. The more Meryl Robert leaned into her work, the more the social hierarchy of the room began to dissolve, leaving Cho looking less like a king and more like a loud, ignored child. He could feel the eyes of his men on him, heavy with a newfound silent questioning. If he couldn't break a lone woman at a dinner table, how could he hold the city? He stood up abruptly, the heavy legs of his chair screeching against the polished floor like a dying animal. The sound forced several diners to jump, but Meryl didn't so much as blink. Cho rounded his table, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her, his shadow swallowing the light on her documents. "I've decided I don't like your face," Cho spat, his voice no longer a performance for the room, but a low, dangerous vibration. "I don't like the way you sit there acting like you're better than everyone else because you carry a briefcase full of worthless promises." He reached down, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, his fingers twitching with the urge to physically disrupt her composure. Instead, he grabbed the corner of her case file, the one marked with the bold federal seal. He didn't pull it away, he simply pressed his thumb firmly onto the paper, leaving a smudged, oily print over the text. "You're a ghost," he hissed, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "A little gray mouse playing in a world of lions. You spend your life chasing shadows, writing your little reports, thinking you're doing something noble. But let me tell you a secret. The counsel. The only reason you're allowed to exist is because men like me haven't found a reason to step on you yet." The insult wasn't just personal anymore. It was an assault on her entire existence. He mocked the years of law school, the late nights in the archives, and the oath she had taken to protect the public. He called her a parasite of the state, a woman who only felt powerful because she had a government-issued badge to hide her inadequacies. He leaned in closer still, the heat of his anger radiating off him. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a jagged edge. "Stop hiding behind the paper and look at the man who owns the air you're breathing. Or are you as hollow as the laws you're trying to enforce?" The air in the bistro seemed to vanish. The silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting for a spark. Cho was convinced he had finally reached her. He saw the way the light caught the edge of her silver pen, the way her fingers remained poised over the page. He expected her to crumble, to look up with eyes full of the fear he had spent a lifetime cultivating in others. But Meryl Robert was not afraid. She was finished. She didn't look up to meet his gaze, not yet. Instead, she slowly, deliberately capped her pen. The click of the silver cap was as loud as a gunshot in the hushed restaurant. She began to gather her papers, smoothing the page where his thumb had left its mark with a touch that was clinical, almost mourning the desecration of the evidence. The escalation had reached its zenith. The predator had cornered his prey, unaware that he had walked straight into a cage of his own making. The predator had overextended. Cho Ju-bin remained leaned over the table, his thumb still pressing into the federal document, his breath a foul heat against Meryl's steady composure. He was waiting for the snap, the moment the gray mouse would finally squeak in terror. Meryl Robert did not squeak. Instead, she performed a series of movements that were so precise, so devoid of fear, that they carried the weight of a ritual. She reached out and placed her hand over the documents, her fingers brushing against Cho's sleeve with a touch as cold as marble. Slowly, she began to slide the papers back into the leather interior of her briefcase. The sound of the papers sliding against one another was the only noise in the vacuum of the restaurant. One by one, the incriminating lines of text, the lists of shell companies, and the detailed maps of the young organization's assets disappeared into the dark maw of the case. She was retracting the bait, the work was done, and the trap was now fully occupied. With a deliberate, audible snap, she closed the latches of the briefcase. The twin metallic clicks echoed off the hand-carved dark walnut walls, sounding like the closing of a cell door. The closing of the briefcase marked the exact moment the diner ceased to exist. In her place sat the architect of a legal execution. Meryl didn't stand up immediately. She remained seated, looking at the closed lid of her case as if it were a tombstone for Cho's empire. The shift in the air was palpable. The social tension that had been suffocating the room suddenly crystallized into something much sharper and more dangerous: institutional authority. Cho felt the change, and he straightened his back, his brow furrowing as he realized his intimidation had failed to produce a single tremor in her hands. He looked down at the woman who had just packed away her world, and for the first time that evening, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected to break her spirit. Instead, he had watched her finalize a task. "What is that supposed to mean?" Cho asked, his voice cracking slightly, the bravado starting to leak out of the seams. "You think closing a bag makes you something? You think you can just walk away from me?" Meryl finally turned her head. She didn't look at his neck tattoos or his expensive suit. She looked directly into his eyes with a gaze that was entirely clinical, as if she were examining a specimen under a microscope. There was no anger in her expression, and only a terrifyingly calm sense of completion. "The time for reading is over, Mr. Cho," she said. Her voice was low, carrying a resonance that traveled further than any of his shouts. It was the voice of a woman who had spent a decade speaking in rooms where lives were decided by a single sentence. She stood up then, her movements fluid and commanding. She didn't adjust her blazer or check her reflection. She simply gripped the handle of her briefcase and held it at her side. The room watched, breathless, as the power dynamic flipped entirely. Cho Ju-bin was still standing, still surrounded by his men, but as Meryl Robert squared her shoulders, he suddenly looked very small, like a man standing on a sand castle while the tide was coming in. Meryl Robert stood with a composed, lethal stillness, as the briefcase hanging at her side like a sheathed weapon. The restaurant had fallen into a tomb-like silence, the kind that precedes a landslide. Cho Ju-bin remained half-entrenched in her personal space, his face a mask of sweating bravado, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of the fear he felt he was owed. He was still waiting for her to break, unaware that he was the one already shattered. "You're still standing here," Meryl said, her voice cutting through the heavy air with the precision of a diamond-tipped blade. It wasn't a question, it was an observation of his tactical error. Cho forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, a dry rattle in his throat. "I'm standing here because I own this block, and you're leaving because I'm done playing with you. Go back to your cubicle, Mouse. Go file your little reports." Meryl didn't move. She didn't look at his associates, who were now shifting uncomfortably, their instincts screaming that the atmosphere had turned lethal. She locked her gaze onto Cho's, and for the first time, she allowed the full weight of her authority to surface. The quiet bureaucrat evaporated, replaced by the relentless engine of the Department of Justice. "My name is Meryl Robert," she stated. The name didn't just hang in the air, it landed with the force of an iron gate closing. "I am Lead Federal Counsel for the Organized Crime Task Force." Cho's smirk didn't disappear. It froze, trapped in a grotesque half-state between mockery and realization. The name Meryl Robert had been a ghost story whispered in the back rooms of his warehouses for 18 months. She was the shadow that moved through bank records. When she was the signature at the bottom of the warrants that had turned his associates into informants. "The documents you so carelessly smudged," she continued, her tone conversational yet glacial, "are the final signed affidavits for the RICO indictment of KJ Enterprises, specifically the sections detailing the maritime smuggling routes you personally authorized 3 weeks ago." The color didn't just leave Cho's face. It seemed to be sucked out of his very soul. He stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for the table to steady himself. The tattoos on his neck, once symbols of his untouchable status, now looked like targets. The paper pusher he had spent the last hour humiliating was not a victim of his power. She was the architect of its destruction. "You've spent the evening performing for a room that no longer belongs to you." "Mr. Cho," Meryl said, taking a single, measured step toward him. Cho retreated further, his back hitting the hand-carved, dark walnut pillar. "You mistook my silence for weakness. In reality, I was simply waiting for my dinner to arrive while your assets were being frozen in real time. As of 6 minutes ago, your offshore accounts in the Caymans have been flagged, and your primary distribution hub in Queens is being breached by a tactical team." The silence that followed was absolute. Cho Ju-bin looked around the room, but the audience he had cultivated was gone. His associates were looking at the exits, their loyalty dissolving in the face of federal inevitability. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been reclaimed by the institution Meryl represented. She was no longer a diner, she was the law, and she was done playing. And the air in the restaurant didn't just feel cold, it felt chemically altered, stripped of the warmth and prestige Cho had relied on to fuel his ego. He stood paralyzed against the dark walnut pillar, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The word indictment echoed in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell, vibrating through the very foundation of the life he had built on blood and bravado. Meryl Robert did not look away. Her gaze remained a steady, unrelenting pressure, pinning him to the reality he had tried so hard to ignore. She reached into her blazer and produced a high-end mobile device, the screen glowing with a series of scrolling notifications. "Look at your phone, Mr. Cho," she said, her voice dropping into a register of finality. "Hey, I suspect your chief financial officer has been trying to reach you for the last 3 minutes." As if on command, the device in Cho's pocket began to vibrate against his hip, a frantic, buzzing intrusion. He fumbled for it, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the gold-plated casing onto the floor. When he finally managed to ignite the screen, his eyes went wide. There were 14 missed calls and a string of messages that all said the same thing in varying degrees of panic. The accounts are gone. The feds are in the server. We're locked out. The freeze isn't just a legal theory, Meryl continued, her tone as detached as a weather report. It's a digital amputation. By the time you walk out of these doors, your credit cards will be plastic scrap. Your vehicles are being flagged for impound. Even the lease on the penthouse you're so proud of is being contested under the Asset Forfeiture Act. You are currently standing in a room you can no longer afford to pay for. Cho's associates, men who had toasted to his health only moments before, began to drift toward the edges of the room. The sycophantic smiles were gone, replaced by the calculating stares of survivors looking for a lifeboat. They saw the federal stamp on the documents she had packed away and realized that their proximity to Cho Ju-bin had gone from a privilege to a liability. Cho looked at his men, his mouth working silently, searching for the right threat or the right bribe to bring them back into formation. But there was no currency left in his pocket that could buy loyalty against the Lead Federal Counsel. He looked back at Meryl, his face a distorted mask of desperation. The realization was sinking in. This wasn't just a social humiliation. It was an existential erasure. "You can't do this," he whispered, the sound cracking with a sudden, pathetic vulnerability. "I have connections. I have people who make things happen." "You had connections," Meryl corrected, her voice rising just enough to command the entire room. "But those people are currently being served their own subpoenas. You spent your evening trying to humiliate a quiet bureaucrat, Mr. Cho. While you were focused on the performance, I was focused on the procedure. And the procedure is now complete." She adjusted the strap of her briefcase, the movement sharp and definitive. The indictment was no longer just a stack of paper in her bag. It was a physical weight crushing the man in front of her. Cho Ju-bin, the king of the neighborhood. It was now nothing more than a man whose world had been turned into a block of ice, waiting for the inevitable hammer to fall. The predator's circle, once a fortress of coordinated loyalty, began to splinter with the clinical speed of a glass pane hitting concrete. The silence that followed Meryl's declaration was not empty. It was filled with the frantic, silent calculations of men who had built their lives on the shifting sands of Cho Ju-bin's favor. For years, his associates had been his armor, but as they looked at the federal seal resting in Meryl's steady hand, that armor became a cage. The man with the scarred eyebrow, Cho's most trusted enforcer, was the first to move. He didn't reach for a weapon or shout a defense. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back, increasing the physical distance between himself and the man who was now a walking lightning rod for the Department of Justice. It was a subtle gesture, but in the high-stakes theater of the Gilded Lily, it was a public execution of Cho's authority. One by one, the others followed suit, their eyes darting toward the exits, their body language shifting from aggressive protection to a desperate, individual search for an alibi. Cho felt the vacuum opening up around him. He turned to his left, looking for the usual nodding heads and sycophantic grins, but he found only the averted gazes of men who were already mentally rehearsing their testimonies. The Empire was no longer a solid entity. It was a collection of panicked individuals realized that the woman they had spent the hour mocking held the keys to their future selves. "You sit down!" Cho hissed at his lead advisor, his voice cracking with the strain of a collapsing facade. "We aren't done here. Tell her about the lawyers. Tell her who we know." The advisor, a man who had made a career out of fixing Cho's messes, didn't sit. He didn't even look at Cho. He looked at Meryl with the expression that was a nauseating mixture of fear and plea for mercy. "I have my own representation, Mr. Cho," the man whispered, his voice trembling. "I suggest you do the same. I I have a family to think about. The reputation Cho had spent a decade cultivating, the image of the untouchable, the man who could insult the law to its face and walk away laughing, shattered in the reflection of the gold-framed mirrors. The other diners, the very people Cho had tried to impress with his performance, you were no longer looking at him with fear. They were looking at him with the cold curiosity one reserves for a car wreck. The whispers had returned, but they weren't about his power, they were about his end. Meryl watched the disintegration with the same unblinking composure she had maintained throughout the night. To her, this wasn't a tragedy, it was a chemical reaction. When you introduce the truth into a room built on lies, the structures of power naturally dissolve. She stood at the center of the storm, the only fixed point in a room of sudden chaos. "Your reputation was built on the illusion of impunity, Mr. Cho," Meryl said, her voice rising above the low-frequency hum of the fleeing associates. "But illusions require an audience that believes in them, and as you can see, your audience has left the building." She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard over the rising panic. The cracks in the empire were no longer subtle. They were wide enough to swallow the man whole. Cho Ju-bin stood alone at the table, surrounded by half-eaten truffles and expensive bourbon, a king of nothing, while the quiet woman with the briefcase prepared to deliver the final procedural blow. The chaos at the table adjacent to Meryl was merely the surface ripple of a much deeper, more tectonic shift occurring beneath the city's feet. While Cho Ju-bin stood paralyzed, watching his associates vanish into the night, the invisible machinery of the federal government was already grinding his legacy into dust. This was the part of the process Meryl respected most, the silent, inevitable friction of the law that required no shouting and no spectacle to achieve total victory. Outside the restaurant, the street was deceptively still, but the digital landscape was a battlefield. In a secure room in Lower Manhattan, a team of analysts under Meryl's direct command was executing the final phase of the operation she had spent 18 months perfecting. With every passing second, the due process she had promised was manifesting in 1,000 different ways. The formal charges were no longer just ink on a page, they were active triggers. As Meryl stood calmly by the hand-carved dark walnut pillar, a series of pre-coordinated raids were commencing across 3 boroughs. The shipping manifests she had tucked into her briefcase minutes ago were being cross-referenced with real-time GPS coordinates of the Jung organization's fleet. Somewhere in a warehouse in Queens, the heavy steel doors were being breached not by a rival gang but by agents carrying the same federal authority Meryl projected in the bistro. The process was clinical. Behind the scenes, the grand jury testimony, stored for weeks in encrypted vaults, was being unsealed. The names of Cho's connections were being entered into a database that would trigger a wave of subpoenas by sunrise. For Cho, the world was ending in a single room, but for the Department of Justice, it was a synchronized removal of a tumor. Meryl checked her watch once more. The second hand swept forward with a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the unfolding operation. She looked at Cho, who was now frantically trying to dial a number on his phone, only to find that his service had been disconnected as part of the asset seizure. The silence of his dead device was the most honest answer he would receive all night. "The wheels are turning, Mr. Cho," Meryl said, her voice a calm anchor in the rising tide of his panic. "You see, the law doesn't need to be loud to be absolute. It doesn't need to wear a navy suit or have tattoos to prove its strength. It simply needs to be right." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't need to see the final look of defeat on his face. She would see it later, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a courtroom. The due process she had initiated was a self-sustaining force now, a series of dominoes falling with mathematical certainty. She turned toward the exit. Her briefcase held firmly at her side, leaving the wreckage of Cho's ego behind. As she stepped out into the cool Manhattan air, the distant sound of a siren began to wail, a herald of the formal reckoning that was no longer a threat, but a reality. 3 months later, the opulent shadows of the Gilded Lily had been replaced by the sterile, unforgiving brightness of a federal courtroom. Here, the walls were not walnut, but cold, institutional stone, and the only scent in the air was the sharp tang of floor wax and the dry dust of old law books. The quiet was no longer the hushed reverence of a high-end restaurant. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a cage. Cho Ju-bin sat at the defense table, his transformation complete. The fitted navy suit was gone, replaced by a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that made him look withered and small. Without the theater of his associates or the glow of a chandelier, the tattoos on his neck looked like scars of a previous life, markings of a man who had mistakenly believed himself to be a king. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands, once so quick to mock and point, now shackled and resting heavily on the wood. Across the aisle, Meryl Robert moved with a composed, lethal stillness. She wore the same style of dark blazer she had worn that night at the bistro, but here it was not a disguise. It was a uniform. She didn't look like a diner anymore. She looked like the manifestation of a debt being collected. When the bailiff called her name, Meryl stood. She didn't rush. She didn't look for the cameras or play to the gallery. She walked to the center of the room, on her footsteps echoing with a steady metronomic cadence that seemed to count down the final seconds of Cho's freedom. She placed her briefcase on the podium, the same leather case that Cho had once derided as a bag of worthless promises. She opened it, and the sound of the metallic latches snapping open filled the room, a final echo of the night her silence had first become a weapon. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, the final sentencing recommendation. "The defendant," Meryl began, her voice even and unmovable, "built an empire on the assumption that he was above the reach of the law. He believed that power was a matter of volume, of intimidation, and of the ability to humiliate those he deemed beneath him." Cho's head sank lower. He remembered the smell of the Cabernet, the taste of the truffles, and the way he had leaned over her table to mock her federal stamp. He remembered calling her a gray mouse. "But the law," Meryl continued, turning slightly to look at the man in the orange jumpsuit, "is not a performance. It is a procedure. It is a slow, methodical accumulation of truth that eventually crushes those who try to ignore it." She laid the document on the clerk's desk. It was the final signature in a case she had built with the patience of a diamond cutter. As the judge began to read the sentence, 25 years without the possibility of parole, Meryl simply gathered her things. She didn't smirk, and she didn't gloat. As the marshals rose to lead Cho away, he finally looked up, his eyes meeting Meryl's for the last time. He searched for a flicker of triumph or a spark of revenge in her expression, but he found only the same clinical, professional detachment he had seen at the restaurant. To Meryl Robert, he wasn't a fallen rival or a conquered enemy. He was simply a file that had been processed, a case that had been closed, and a silence that had finally been made permanent. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, leaving Cho Ju-bin to the absolute, institutional silence he had earned.